Back when I was in my first year of medical school, one of the things that I wish I had learned as quickly as possible was physiology. Like everything makes perfect sense when you studied physiology very well. You can understand anatomy, pharmacology, and pathology. If you can understand the normal body physiology, then you can relate things much faster in every disease that you will encounter without memorizing tons of information that surely you will forget. Now, if you're here because you want to read a physiology textbook for your upcoming exam and you realize that you may not have enough time to read all chapters, then you're in the right video because I will discuss Guyton and Hall in every chapter in just 20 minutes. So you can deal with other things that you need to do without, of course, compromising completeness. Right. Here we're going to talk about kidneys and their general function. This is the first chapter for Unit 5. The first part of this chapter discusses the general functions of the kidney. First function is the removal of metabolic waste products, foreign chemicals, drugs, and hormone metabolites. One good example is your ammonia. Ammonia is removed by your body and then converts it into urea. This urea will be excreted by your kidneys as urine, as depicted in this urea cycle. Next metabolic product is your creatinine. Creatinine came from creatine and phosphocreatine. These two metabolic products generates ATP or energy during an exercise. Then over time, your creatine and your phosphocreatine gets converted into creatinine, which will be excreted by your kidney as urine. Another byproduct, is created by your purine catabolism. When some of your cells die, it releases purine, particularly adenine and guanine. These two nucleic acid will be converted into a uric acid, which will be excreted by your kidney in the form of urine as well. Same goes with your heme catabolism, in which your heme that came from your broken red blood cell will be converted into urobilinogen, which will enter your renal circulation and be added into your urine. This urobilinogen is what gives your urine its slightly yellowish color. Right. Now, another function of the kidney is regulation of water and electrolyte balances. The graph tells us that our kidney excretes water and other electrolytes depending on our intake. When we, for example, increases our sodium intake, our kidneys will adjust so it can remove any excess sodium that has accumulated in our body. Now, how does it do that? First, we need to understand that if we increase our salt intake, for example, up to 300, most of that salt will attract water from our interstitial space and then going to your blood vessels. As a result, it will raise your extracellular fluid volume or the blood volume slightly. Hence, we can see here in the second graph. Aside from increasing your fluid volume, it also releases several hormones to increase sodium excretion, as you can see here in these broken lines, until it will match your intake. Then after some time, your sodium will be normal again. Because of this mechanism, your kidney is responsible for maintaining your arterial pressure by secreting various hormones in which it controls your arterial pressure. More about that later. Next function is the regulation of acid and base balance. Together with your lungs, they excrete acid and regulate your buffer store. In addition, only our kidneys has the capacity to remove acid which are generated by the metabolism of products. Another function is our kidneys releases erythropoietin in response to hypoxia or decreasing level of oxygen. This erythropoietin will travel to your bone marrow to increase the production of red blood cells. That's why in patients with kidney disease will experience anemia as a result of decreased erythropoietin production. Next function is that our kidney also produces calcitriol, which is important for the normal calcium deposition in our bones and increases calcium reabsorption in our GI tract. It basically regulates the production of vitamin B or calcitriol. Lastly, our kidneys also synthesizes glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors like amino acids in situations like prolonged fasting. This process is known as gluconeogenesis. Don't worry, we will be explaining these concepts in close detail in the succeeding chapters. Okay, let's talk about the general organization of the kidneys and urinary tract. Our kidney is located retroperitoneally, meaning they are outside of the peritoneal cavity, and it weighs 150 grams. Now, what's the difference between renal sinus and renal hilum? The renal sinus refers to the space where it contains the renal pelvis, renal calyces, blood vessels, nerves, and fats, while renal hilum is the indented area on the middle side of each kidney. Think of it as the entrance to the renal sinus. Next structure is the renal capsule. Basically, our kidney is surrounded by a tough, fibrous capsule that protects the delicate inner structure of this organ. Now, if we cut the organ from top to bottom, you can easily distinguish the two major regions of our kidneys, the outer cortex and the inner medulla. Your medulla is divided into these 8 to 10 inverted triangles known as the renal pyramids. The base of the pyramid is between the cortex and the medulla, while the apex ends at the papilla. The urine will be formed in your renal pyramids, then it will be drained into your papilla, which is continuous to the minor calyx, then to your major calyx, and then to your renal pelvis down to your ureter. All of these structures from your calyces to the ureter has contractile elements that pushes urine towards the bladder, where urine is collected. Right. Normally, about 1,100 ml per minute of the blood goes to your kidney, roughly about 22% of the total cardiac output. The renal artery branches to form your interlobar artery, then into your arcuate artery, this one that lines your pyramids, then into interlobular arteries, also called radial arteries, and then branched into afferent arterioles, which lead to the glomerular capillaries, where filtration of fluids and solutes occurs to form your urine. Note that red blood cells and plasma proteins are not permeable or they cannot traverse through your glomerular capillaries. More about that later. Then the end of each glomerulus combine together to form efferent arteriole, which creates another capillary network known as peritubular capillaries that wraps your tubules. Okay, as you noticed, we have two types of capillaries, the glomerular capillaries and the peritubular capillaries. The glomerular capillaries, they have a higher hydrostatic pressure. Basically, this is the force that pushes your fluid to move from the capillary to the Bowman's capsule. And we call that process as filtration. Whereas the the peritubular capillaries have lower hydrostatic pressure compared to its surrounding and to its tubules. What happens is instead of filtration, the fluid tends to move from your tubules to your interstitial fluid back to your capillaries. And we call that process as reabsorption. Now, by adjusting the resistance, take note that if we change the resistance of the afferent and efferent arteriole, you are also changing the pressure distal to that blood vessel constriction. Note that if we constrict, we create a high resistance blood vessels, decreasing the pressure distal to that constriction. Conversely, if we dilate our blood vessels, we are creating a low resistance, increasing the pressure distal to the constriction. More about this later. And then your peritubular capillaries, the one that wraps your renal tubule, will empty into the vessels of the venous system, draining blood to your interlobular vein, then arcuate vein, then interlobar vein, and then to your renal vein. Right. The human kidney has about 1 million nephron, which is responsible for forming our urine. Sadly, we cannot generate new nephrons. Patients with renal injury, for example, diseases or normal aging, actually have a declining number of functional nephrons. Fun fact, at the age of 40, the number of nephron declines 10% every year. No? More about that later. Each nephron contains a glomerular capillaries through which fluids and solids are filtered from the blood. The filtered fluid flow into the Bowman's capsule that enwraps totally your glomerulus. Then the filtered fluid will flow to your proximal tubule, which is located at the cortex of the kidney. Then to your loop of Henle, the decreasing loop of Henle, and then ascending loop of Henle, located at the medulla of your kidney. Notice that the walls of all portions of the descending limb is very thin. Same with your ascending limb. That is why they are called the thin segments of the loop of Henle. But for the ascending limb, as it moves toward the cortex, its wall thickens, thus sometimes called the thick segment of the ascending limb. Then, at the end of this thick ascending limb, lines a specialized epithelial cells known as macula densa. These cells has a very, very important role in regulating your nephron function. We will discuss uh, in specific detail in just a moment. Then, after your macula densa, your urine will flow to your distal tubule located at your cortex, which will drain into the connecting tubule, then to your cortical collecting tubule from other nephrons to form a large collecting duct toward towards your medulla and become your medullary collecting duct until the urine empties into the renal pelvis. Okay, we can classify nephron depending on how deep it is located. For the cortical nephron, its glomeruli are located at the outer cortex, while for the juxtamedullary nephrons, its glomeruli are located near the medulla. In terms of vascularities, the cortical nephron is surrounded by an extensive network of peritubular capillaries that lies not so deep in the medulla, while for your juxtamedullary nephrons, long efferent arterioles extend from the cortex down to your medulla, sometimes reaching the renal papillae. These blood vessels are known as vasa recta. Let's first talk about the physiologic anatomy of the bladder. Our bladder is made up of two different parts: the body, where urine gets collected, and the neck that connects to your urethra. It is sometimes called your posterior urethra because of its anatomical position. Then the wall of our bladder is known as the detrusor muscle, which, when it contracts, it empties your bladder. Now, the cells of these muscles are actually fused with one another, so that when even a low electrical signal exists, it can spread throughout the entire muscle, thus contracting the bladder as a single muscle. At the posterior part of your bladder, you can see a triangle known as the trigone. The apex of this trigone opens into the posterior urethra, and the base is where your ureter enters. You can easily identify the trigone because of its smooth mucosa, while for the rest of the wall is that it is pretty rough to form what is known as the rugae. This is your bladder neck, and its wall is still made up of your detrusor muscle, now called the internal sphincter. Naturally, this muscle is contracted to prevent emptying of the urine until the stimulus arrives. Then, your urethra passes a structure known as the urogenital diaphragm. That makes us your external sphincter. This muscle can be controlled voluntarily by conscious control, compared to your internal sphincter. Now, the main nerve supply of your bladder is via the pelvic nerves through your sacral plexus, originating with cord segments S2 and S3. Pelvic nerves have sensory fibers that innervates your bladder, which detects stretch of the bladder wall. Same with the stretch signals detected in your urethra, which is responsible for initiating reflexes that causes bladder emptying. Later, it will be discussed in a greater detail. Another important innervation is to the external bladder sphincter, which is innervated by the pudendal nerves. This is responsible for the voluntary control of micturition. Lastly, the bladder receives your sympathetic innervation from your hypogastric nerves, that is responsible for the sensation of fullness and pain. When the formed urine flows to the renal calyces, it stretches its walls, which stimulates peristaltic activities. Due to this increasing pacemaker activity, it creates a wave-like movement to allow your urine to be pushed towards the renal pelvis, then to your bladder. Another important thing to note here is that the peristaltic contraction in the ureter is enhanced by parasympathetic stimulation and inhibited by sympathetic stimulation, which makes sense because you don't want to urinate when you're running for your life. Now, when the detrusor muscle contracts, it compresses the ureter in order to prevent the urine from backflowing from the bladder when it contracts. But urine can still flow from the ureter to the bladder because remember that the ureter has peristaltic contraction that can push urine to your bladder even when it is contracting. Right. However, in some people, the distance that the ureter courses through the bladder wall is less than normal. That is why when the bladder contracts, it does not completely occludes the ureter. As a result, the urine in the bladder is pushed backwards into the ureter and back to your kidney during bladder contraction. This is known as vesicoureteral reflux. This condition enlarges the ureter and the pressure can damage your kidneys. The ureter is heavily supplied by nerve fibers. When there is an occlusion to the ureter, for example, a ureteral stone, the ureter will contract as a response to that occlusion. As a result, it will stimulate your nerve fibers, causing pain. Aside from that, it will trigger a sympathetic reflex to your kidney. What happens is that it will constrict your renal arterioles and thereby decreasing urine output, as we discussed earlier. It's called a ureterorenal reflex. That is a safety mechanism for the kidney to decrease urine output in an occluded ureter. As the volume of our bladder increases, the pressure also increases as shown in this cystometrogram. Our bladder has sensory stretch receptors that every time the bladder is filling with urine, it increases its pressure. As a result, it will send signals through the pelvic nerves and then back again to the bladder through the same nerves. That signals your bladder to contract and try releasing the urine, thus further raising the intravesical pressure as shown in these broken lines. However, if the bladder is only partially filled, it automatically relaxes, thus bringing the pressure down again as depicted. As the bladder continues to fill, the process continues, but now with greater pressure every time it contracts, as shown in this increasing cystogram. This reflex continues until it reaches its strongest degree of contraction. Until such time, the detrusor muscle gets tired or fatigued. Thus, the self-regenerative cycle stops, allowing your bladder to relax, creating the sensation that we don't need to urinate anymore. However, as your bladder becomes filled with more and more urine, the reflex can start all over again, but this time the contractions are powerful than before. Once this reflex is powerful enough, your brain will send signal to your pudendal nerves to voluntarily inhibit your external sphincter, allowing you to urinate consciously. Okay, but if you still fail to release the urine, the micturition reflex will continue with more power than ever before. Now let's talk about how you control urination or micturition. Your brain normally inhibits your micturition reflex, unless when micturition is desired. So even when micturition reflex occurs, your brain, mainly the pons, can prevent micturition to occur until you find a convenient time and place. When you consciously decided to urinate, your brain will initiate the micturition reflex at the same time relaxes your external urinary sphincter, allowing your urine to flow from your bladder to your urethra. Now, how about voluntary urination? Involuntary urination, it involves your abdominal muscle, in which we contract our abdominal muscle to increase the pressure of your bladder. As a result, the stretch receptors activates the micturition reflex and simultaneously relaxes your external sphincter. Now let's talk about few abnormalities of micturition. First, if the sensory fibers got severed or damaged, micturition reflex cannot occur even when the fibers of conscious control is intact. What happens is that the bladder will be filled with more and more urine, more than its capacity. Because remember, micturition reflex starts at the sensory fibers. Now, you have a condition known as overflow incontinence. Two main cause of this overflow incontinence is, for example, crush injury and bacterial infection, for example, syphilis. The bacteria destroys the dorsal root nerves, causing a condition known as tabes dorsalis, or resulting in a bladder condition called tabetic bladder. Another abnormality occurs when the damage is above your sacral region of the spinal cord. During the first days of the injury, micturition and voluntary control are suppressed. That's why they are catheterized to prevent the overstretching of the bladder. As time goes by, the micturition reflex return back to normal. But the voluntary control is now impaired because the signal cannot get through the damaged cord. As a result, incontinence occurs or periodic unannounced urination occurs as the bladder contracts, overcoming the contracted external sphincter. And last abnormality is your damage to the brain and the spinal cord itself. Remember that your pons is the one that inhibits your micturition reflex. Without that pons, you do not have an inhibition to that reflex. Thus, even a small quantity of urine can stimulate your micturition reflex, promoting frequent urination, a condition known as uninhibited neurogenic bladder. Alright, these are the basic kidney processes that determines the composition of the urine. As you can see in this formula, the urine excretion rate is equals to the rate of filtration. That is, the movement of fluids from the glomerular capillaries to your Bowman's capsule, minus the rate of reabsorption, that is, the movement of fluid from your tubules back to your capillaries, plus the rate at which the substances from the peritubular capillaries moves into your tubules. And we call that secretion. Substances like urea, creatinine, uric acid, and urates are filtered but are poorly reabsorbed. That's why they are excreted in large amounts, as you can see in this diagram. While sodium ions chloride and bicarbonate are highly reabsorbed. That's why they appear in small amounts in your urine, as shown in letter B. For amino acid and glucose, they are completely reabsorbed, and thus they do not appear in the urine, as depicted in diagram letter C. For acids and bases, aside from filtration, additional quantities of these substances are also secreted, so they will be excreted in high amounts in your urine. This is important to note that all of these processes depends on the needs of the body. Changes in glomerular filtration and tubular absorption act in a coordinated manner to produce the necessary changes in renal excretion. Now, question: why are large amount of solutes filtered and then reabsorbed by the kidneys? First reason is that high GFR allows the removal of waste products in large quantities that are also poorly reabsorbed. Meaning, the higher the GFR, the faster the removal of waste products. Second reason is that it allows the plasma to be filtered and processed in the kidneys many times a day. Since our plasma is only 3 liters, whereas the GFR is about 180 liters per day, which can filter the plasma 60 times each day. Thus, high GFR allows the kidney to control the volume and composition of the body fluids precisely and rapidly. And that's it for the first chapter of Unit 5 of Guyton and Hall Physiology. I hope you like it and you understood something. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell. See you on the next chapter.